Her ex left her screaming in labor beside the flooded road. But the vampire king who swept her into his arms moved with inhuman grace, his voice steady as he promised the hospital in time. They thought immortals couldn't understand human fragility, but he'd lost too many mortals to let another slip through his fingers. The first contraction hit Sophia Chen like lightning, splitting her spine as Marcus gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his face pale in the dashboard glow. Outside Highway 47, October rain hammered the windshield in sheets so thick the wipers could barely keep pace. And through the storm she could see nothing but darkness pressing against their small cocoon of warmth and light. 3 minutes later, another wave of pain crashed through her belly, stealing her breath as she pressed both hands against the door handle, trying to find something solid to anchor herself to while her world tilted sideways. Marcus pulled over to the shoulder with a screech of wet tires on asphalt, his breathing rapid and shallow as he stared at her with wide, terrified eyes that reflected the green glow of the radio display. "I can't do this," he whispered, his voice cracking like a teenage boy's as another contraction seized her body and made her cry out in pain that echoed through the small car. "Sophia, I'm sorry. I thought I could handle it, but I can't watch you go through this. I can't be responsible if something goes wrong. I just can't." And before she could process his words fully, he was opening his door and stepping out into the howling storm. The cold air rushed in like a slap as he fumbled with something in the back seat, his movements jerky and panicked, and then he was back in the driver's seat without looking at her, his hands shaking as he put the car in drive. "You'll be fine. Someone will find you. There's a gas station a few miles back," he muttered, as he pulled away from the shoulder, leaving her standing in the rain with her overnight bag at her feet, and another contraction building like a tsunami in her lower back. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The taillights of their Honda disappeared around the curve, taking with them the last vestiges of the life she thought she knew. And suddenly, she was alone on a flooded highway, with her baby trying to enter the world 3 weeks early, in the middle of the worst storm of the year. Lightning illuminated the bare trees that lined the road like skeletal fingers reaching toward the black sky, and the wind howled through their branches with a sound like voices crying out in ancient languages she couldn't understand. Her phone was dead, the battery drained from calling Marcus repeatedly during the evening when her contractions first started, and now she had no way to summon help as the next wave of pain doubled her over and forced her to her knees on the wet asphalt. The temperature was dropping fast, October in upstate New York turning vicious as the storm front moved through, and she could feel her body shivering uncontrollably between contractions as she struggled to find shelter under the skeletal overhang of a dead oak tree. Terror clawed at her throat like a living thing, whispering that she would die here alone on this forgotten stretch of highway, that her baby would never take a first breath or feel sunlight on its face, or hear her voice singing lullabies in the quiet hours before dawn. But then something shifted deep in her chest, a fierce, protective instinct that burned hotter than fear, and she pushed herself back to her feet with both hands pressed against the tree trunk for support. She would not let her child die because Marcus was a coward, would not surrender to the storm and the dark just because the man she thought loved her had proven himself weak when strength was needed most. Another contraction seized her, and she breathed through it the way the birthing class instructor had taught them, counting backwards from 10 and visualizing her cervix opening like a flower blooming in fast forward, preparing the way for her baby to enter the world safely despite the chaos surrounding them. When the pain ebbed, she started walking toward where she remembered seeing a bridge in the lightning flashes, thinking there might be shelter underneath where she could wait out the worst of the storm and pray that morning would bring someone traveling this lonely road who might stop to help a woman in labor. From the edge of the forest, ancient eyes watched the small figure stumble through the rain, and Dorian Blackthorne felt something stir in his chest that he had not experienced for 8 centuries of immortal existence. The woman's pain called to him across the distance like a bell tolling in an empty cathedral, resonating with memories of another stormy night when he had held his beloved Elena as she fought to bring their son into the world of 1247. She had been so young, barely 18, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of summer skies, and he had been mortal then, just a minor lord with holdings in what would someday be called Scotland, helpless to do anything but hold her hand and whisper prayers to gods who seemed deaf to human suffering. The midwife had shaken her head grimly as dawn approached, her weathered face grave as she cleaned blood from her hands, and Elena had grown pale as parchment while their son emerged stillborn, his tiny lungs never drawing breath in the cruel world that had claimed them both. Dorian had raged then, cursing the heavens and demanding answers from the empty air, and in his despair he had sought out the vampire who haunted the ancient standing stones on his lands, begging for the power to prevent such loss from ever occurring again. The transformation had been agony beyond description. 3 days of fire in his veins as his mortal body died, and something else took its place. But when he emerged from the tomb-like cave, he possessed strength beyond human measure, and senses that could detect life and death from miles away. For 800 years he had ruled the vampire clans of the New World, arbitrating disputes and enforcing the ancient laws that kept their kind hidden from human knowledge. But always he had remained distant from mortal affairs, remembering the lesson of his failure to save the two people who mattered most. Yet now, watching this pregnant woman struggle alone in the storm, he felt the old oaths stirring in his blood like wine, the promises he had made to protect the innocent and defend those who could not defend themselves. Vampire law was clear about interference in human affairs, particularly when exposure might result. But older laws superseded newer ones, and his vows as a knight of the realm still bound him, even in his undead state. The woman stumbled and nearly fell as another contraction racked her body, and Dorian found himself moving through the trees with inhuman speed, his form blurring between the raindrops as he approached the road. He materialized from the shadows like smoke-given substance, his presence both terrifying and oddly comforting as lightning illuminated his pale features and dark hair that seemed untouched by the storm raging around them. The woman looked up at him with eyes wide with pain and exhaustion, but not fear, as if some deep instinct recognized him as salvation rather than threat. And when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of centuries tempered by genuine compassion. "I give you my word," he said, extending one hand toward her while rain streamed down his face like tears. "You and your child will reach safety before this night ends." His touch was unnaturally warm despite his immortal nature, as if the fire that had burned through his veins during his transformation still smoldered somewhere deep within. And his eyes reflected not just the lightning, but 8 centuries of loss and the desperate hope that perhaps this time he might succeed where he had once failed so catastrophically. The black Bentley cut through the storm with predatory grace, its headlights carving tunnels of light through the wall of rain as Dorian's hands moved on the steering wheel with precise control born of supernatural reflexes. In the passenger seat, Sophia Chen fought wave after wave of contractions, her breathing harsh and labored as she studied her mysterious savior through eyes bright with pain and something approaching awe. His profile was sharp as carved marble in the dashboard glow, ageless and aristocratic, with strong hands that guided the powerful car through flooded intersections and around debris with movements too fluid to be entirely human. He spoke to her in low, soothing tones as they raced through the night, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't place, but that seemed to belong to older centuries, telling her to breathe with him and focus on his words rather than the pain tearing through her body. "The hospital is 12 minutes away at current speed," he said with absolute certainty, as if he had calculated every variable and found them manageable. "And your contractions are still 3 minutes apart, which means we have sufficient time to reach the medical team that is already preparing for your arrival." She wanted to ask how he had contacted the hospital without her seeing him use a phone, wanted to understand how he seemed to know exactly where to turn without consulting GPS or street signs. But another contraction seized her and drove all questions from her mind, except the basic animal need to survive and bring her baby safely into the world. Through her pain, she noticed strange details that her rational mind couldn't quite process, like the way his eyes seemed to glow with their own light when headlights from oncoming traffic swept across his face, or how the rearview mirror showed only empty space where his reflection should have been. But these observations felt dreamlike and distant compared to the immediate reality of her body preparing for birth. The car moved through the storm, as if the wind and rain parted before it, never hydroplaning or losing traction despite the treacherous conditions. And she found herself relaxing into the leather seat as his presence wrapped around her like a protective barrier against the chaos of the night. St. Mary's Hospital appeared through the storm like a beacon, its emergency entrance blazing with light as medical personnel in scrubs waited under the covered ambulance bay. And Sophia realized with distant amazement that somehow this stranger had indeed summoned help across impossible distances in the brief moments since she had encountered him. Strong hands lifted her from the car with inhuman gentleness, transferring her to the waiting gurney, as voices called out medical terminology she couldn't follow, and she caught one last glimpse of her savior's pale face before the automatic doors swallowed her into the bright antiseptic world of modern medicine. 3 hours later, as she held her perfect daughter against her chest and marveled at tiny fingers and rosebud lips, she whispered thank you into the quiet room. But when she looked toward the window where she thought she had seen a tall figure standing in the shadows, she found only empty air and the first pale light of dawn breaking through the storm clouds. The nurses could tell her nothing about who had brought her in, only that someone had called ahead with her condition and approximate arrival time. And when she asked to review the security footage, they apologized and explained that the cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the exact window of her arrival, leaving no record of her mysterious savior, except the lingering scent of rain and something else she couldn't name that seemed to belong to wilder, older times when knights still rode through the darkness to rescue maidens in distress. The morning sun filtered through the hospital windows like honey, casting golden rectangles across the linoleum floor of the maternity ward as Sophia Chen cradled her newborn daughter against her chest, marveling at the perfect curve of tiny ears and the way those dark eyes seemed to focus on her face with unusual intensity for such a young baby. Dr. Sarah Martinez bustled around the room with efficient movements, her familiar face a comfort after the surreal events of the previous night, checking monitors and updating charts while stealing glances at the beautiful infant who had entered the world during the worst storm of the decade. Sarah had been Sophia's friend since college, their paths crossing again when Sophia moved to this small upstate town for the quieter pace of life she thought would be perfect for raising a family. And now her expertise as an obstetrician had brought Luna safely into the world despite the dramatic circumstances of her arrival. "I still can't believe someone brought you here and just disappeared," Sarah said, as she adjusted the IV line, her brow furrowed with concern and curiosity as she reviewed the night's events. "The emergency room staff said a man carried you in and provided all the necessary information about your condition. But when they turned around to thank him, he was gone. And somehow our security system had a complete malfunction during exactly those minutes, which the IT department says is virtually impossible given our backup systems." Sophia shifted Luna to her other arm, breathing in that sweet newborn scent that seemed to calm something deep in her chest. But even as she focused on her daughter's peaceful face, she couldn't shake the memory of pale eyes that held centuries of sorrow and hands that were impossibly warm, despite the cold rain that had soaked them both. The door opened with a soft whoosh, and Marcus Reeves stepped into the room, his hair disheveled and clothes wrinkled as if he had slept in his car, carrying a bouquet of gas station flowers and wearing an expression of contrived remorse that immediately set Sophia's teeth on edge. Baby, I'm so sorry, he began, his voice taking on that wheedling tone she had learned to recognize as manipulation disguised as vulnerability. The car broke down right after I dropped you off, and I couldn't get cell service in that dead zone. I walked for miles trying to find help, but by the time I got back, you were gone, and I've been searching hospitals all night. Sarah's expression hardened as she looked between them, her medical training making her sensitive to signs of distress in her patients. And Sophia felt a surge of clarity cut through her exhaustion like a blade through silk. You left me, she said simply, her voice steady despite the tremor of anger building in her chest. You panicked when I needed you most, and you drove away because you were too much of a coward to face the possibility that childbirth might be messy or difficult, or require you to be strong for someone else instead of the other way around. Marcus's face flushed red as he stepped closer to the bed, his voice rising in that familiar pattern of deflection and blame that had characterized their relationship for months. You're being dramatic, Sophia. You know I would never abandon you. You're obviously confused from the trauma and the drugs. I was trying to get help, and the storm made everything impossible. You can't seriously believe I would leave you on purpose when you were in labor. But something had changed in Sophia during those hours of terror and pain on the flooded highway. Something fundamental that had crystallized in the moment. A stranger's warm hands had lifted her from despair and carried her to safety. And she looked at Marcus now with eyes cleared of the romantic illusions that had blinded her to his selfishness and emotional immaturity. Luna stirred in her arms and made a soft sound. And Sophia felt the fierce protective instinct that had sustained her through the storm surge through her again, like molten steel in her veins. I want you to leave, she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute finality that made Marcus step back in surprise. I want you to leave and never contact me again. And if you try to claim any parental rights to Luna, I will fight you with every resource I have, because a man who abandons a woman in labor has no business being a father to anyone. Sarah moved closer to the bed in a subtle show of support, her hand resting on the call button that would summon security if Marcus became aggressive. And after a moment of tense silence, he threw the cheap flowers on the floor and stormed out with muttered curses that only confirmed Sophia's assessment of his character. An hour later, after Sarah had completed her final examinations and declared both mother and baby healthy enough for discharge, a young nurse appeared with an enormous arrangement of midnight orchids, their deep purple petals seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it, arranged with an artistry that spoke of expensive florists and careful attention to detail. There's no card, the nurse said apologetically, setting the flowers on the windowsill where they seemed to glow with inner luminescence. But whoever sent them has exquisite taste, because I've never seen orchids like these outside of botanical gardens. They must have cost a fortune, and they smell like rain and night-blooming jasmine. Sophia stared at the exotic blooms as Luna settled into deeper sleep against her chest. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard an echo of that cultured voice promising safety in the darkness. But when she tried to focus on the memory, it slipped away like water through her fingers, leaving only the certainty that her life had been fundamentally altered by forces she didn't yet understand. From his position on the fourth level of the hospital parking structure, Dorian Blackthorne watched the windows of the maternity ward with the patience of a predator who had learned over 8 centuries that the most important hunts required absolute stillness and perfect timing. His enhanced vision could see through the glass as clearly as if he stood in the room itself, observing the interplay between Sophia and the man who had abandoned her, noting the way her spine straightened and her voice gained strength as she finally recognized the weakness that had driven him to flee when courage was required. The satisfaction he felt at witnessing her newfound resolve was complicated by darker emotions that stirred memories he had spent decades trying to bury. Visions of another young woman whose strength had not been enough to save her when biology and fate conspired against hope. Elena had possessed that same fierce determination, that same protective fire that burned in new mothers when they held their children for the first time. But her body had betrayed her will, and no amount of love or determination had been sufficient to stem the hemorrhaging that stole her life drop by precious drop. He had tried everything mortal medicine knew in 1247, summoning healers and wise women from across the Scottish Highlands. But when dawn broke over their castle walls, Elena had grown cold in his arms, while their son lay silent and blue in the midwife's trembling hands. In his despair, he had sought out the ancient vampire who haunted the stone circles on his lands, begging for the power to prevent such losses in the future. But when he offered to turn Elena, the creature had laughed bitterly and explained that death could not be reversed, only prolonged, and that the transformation required a living subject to succeed. Now, 8 centuries later, he possessed strength enough to tear apart buildings with his bare hands and senses acute enough to hear a heartbeat from miles away. But still he could not save those he loved from the fundamental fragility of mortal existence. The knowledge that Sophia and her daughter were healthy brought relief that surprised him with its intensity, but it also raised questions about his continued involvement that had no easy answers according to the ancient laws that governed vampire society. His duty as protector of the innocent required him to ensure their safety until the immediate threat had passed. But what constituted immediate threat when dealing with mortals whose entire lives flickered by like candle flames in the span of his immortal existence? Through his network of vampire contacts, he had learned that Sophia Chen was 28 years old, a graphic designer who had moved to this small town from New York City 6 months ago, seeking a quieter environment for raising her expected child. Her family history included 3 generations of women who had experienced difficult pregnancies and complicated births, making her survival of an unassisted labor during a severe storm remarkably fortunate by any medical standard. She had no close relatives in the area and few friends aside from Dr. Martinez, meaning she would be raising her daughter essentially alone unless the worthless father returned to complicate matters, which seemed unlikely given his demonstrated cowardice, but remained a possibility that required monitoring. Victor Dracul had been asking pointed questions through intermediaries, his interest in Dorian's activities suggesting that word of the previous night's intervention had spread through vampire channels faster than anticipated, and where Victor showed interest, violence usually followed with the certainty of sunrise. The ancient Romanian had been challenging Dorian's authority over the North American territories for decades, seeking any sign of weakness or violation of vampire law that might justify a formal challenge to his leadership position, and protecting mortals beyond the strict requirements of necessity could be construed as dangerous sentiment that compromised the security of their entire species. But as Dorian watched Sophia tenderly adjust the blanket around her sleeping daughter, he found that he cared less about Victor's political machinations than about ensuring this particular mortal mother and child remained safe in a world that had already proven itself willing to abandon them when protection was most desperately needed. 3 weeks after Luna's dramatic entrance into the world, Sophia had settled into the rhythm of new motherhood with a competence that surprised her friends and a confidence that Marcus would never have believed possible, rising multiple times each night to nurse her daughter and somehow finding energy during the day to tackle the endless tasks that came with caring for a newborn while managing a household alone. Her small apartment above the bakery on Main Street had been transformed into a nursery wonderland, with Luna's crib positioned near the window, where afternoon sunlight created dancing patterns on the ceiling, and the scent of fresh bread from downstairs, mixed with baby powder and the lingering fragrance of those mysterious midnight orchids that had somehow remained fresh far longer than any flowers should have lasted. Marcus had tried calling twice in the first week, leaving voicemails that alternated between anger and self-pity. But when his new girlfriend Jessica suddenly decided to move back to California without explanation, he seemed to lose interest in pursuing reconciliation with the woman who had so definitively rejected his attempts at manipulation. Sophia discovered that her car, which had been making ominous grinding noises for weeks before Luna's birth, was now running perfectly, despite the fact that she had no memory of scheduling any repairs, and no bills appeared in her mailbox from local mechanics who might have performed the work. The graphic design job she had been courting for months at the prestigious Morrison marketing firm suddenly called with an offer that exceeded her salary expectations and included flexible hours that would allow her to work from home while caring for Luna. Opportunities that seemed almost too good to be true, but that she accepted with gratitude, tinged by bewilderment at her sudden run of good fortune. During the long hours of nursing and rocking her daughter to sleep, Sophia found herself sketching scenes from that stormy night with a compulsion she couldn't explain, her hand moving across the paper to capture details that logic insisted she couldn't possibly remember clearly enough to reproduce with such accuracy. The drawings showed rain-slicked highways and lightning-illuminated trees, but they also included a tall figure with pale skin and dark hair, whose face was always turned away from the viewer, as if her subconscious understood that revealing his features too clearly might somehow break the spell of protection that seemed to surround her and Luna like an invisible shield. Luna was an unusually peaceful baby, rarely crying except when hungry or uncomfortable, but Sophia noticed that on certain evenings when shadows gathered early and the air held that electric quality that preceded storms, her daughter would become absolutely serene in a way that seemed almost supernatural, her dark eyes focusing on empty corners of the room, as if she could see things hidden from normal human perception. Once, during a particularly difficult night when Luna had been fussing for hours, despite Sophia's best efforts to comfort her, the crying had stopped so abruptly that Sophia rushed to check if her daughter was still breathing, only to find the baby gazing peacefully at the window, where nothing was visible except darkness beyond the glass. She had learned to trust these moments of inexplicable calm, using them to catch brief naps or grab quick meals, but always with the strange sense that they were being watched over by someone who remained carefully hidden from view. Marcus made one final attempt to reinsert himself into their lives by appearing at her apartment door after midnight, claiming he had been drinking and wanted to see his daughter. But when Sophia refused to let him inside, he became aggressive and threatened to kick down the door until she called the police. By the time the officers arrived 20 minutes later, they found Marcus unconscious on the front steps, with no memory of how he had ended up there and no signs of injury that might explain his condition, though he complained of vivid dreams about glowing eyes and voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, symptoms the paramedics attributed to alcohol poisoning despite the fact that his blood alcohol level tested completely normal. After that incident, Marcus seemed to develop an aversion to even driving past Sophia's street, and she heard through mutual acquaintances that he had been telling people the neighborhood gave him bad feelings and that he was considering moving to another town entirely, a development that filled her with relief, tempered by curiosity about what exactly had changed his mind so dramatically about pursuing contact with Luna. The November storm struck without warning, transforming the quiet streets of the small upstate town into rivers of wind and rain that sent debris flying through the air like missiles launched by an angry god. And Sophia Chen found herself trapped in the elevator of her apartment building as the power flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging her and 3-month-old Luna into suffocating darkness. Luna had been running a fever since morning, her tiny body burning with heat that no amount of infant acetaminophen seemed to touch, and Sophia had been rushing to get her to the emergency room when the elevator lurched to a stop between the second and third floors, the emergency phone dead and her cell phone showing no signal in the metal box that had become their prison. Luna's breathing was rapid and shallow, her usual peaceful demeanor replaced by the listless quiet that every mother feared, and Sophia felt panic rising in her throat like bile as she pressed the emergency button repeatedly with no response, except the hollow echo of her own voice calling for help into the darkness. The fever was spiking higher. She could feel it through Luna's onesie, and medical knowledge from countless parenting books filled her mind with terrifying possibilities of seizures and brain damage, and outcomes too horrible to contemplate as she paced the small space and tried to think of solutions that didn't exist. Then she heard it, a sound like metal screaming in protest, and the elevator doors began to part with slow, deliberate force that spoke of strength far beyond human capability. revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the emergency lighting of the hallway beyond. He stepped into their confined space with fluid grace that made no sound on the elevator floor. And even in her desperation, Sophia recognized the pale features and dark hair of the man who had saved them once before, though now she could see details that had been hidden in the chaos of that stormy night 3 months ago. His skin was marble white and flawless, untouched by time or weather, and his eyes held depths that spoke of centuries rather than decades, while his movements carried the controlled power of a predator who had learned to move among prey without revealing his true nature. Without a word, he reached for Luna, and Sophia found herself handing over her daughter to this stranger whose touch immediately calmed the baby's fevered restlessness, his unnaturally warm hands seeming to draw heat from Luna's small body as he cradled her with the practiced ease of someone who had held many infants across the span of a very long life. "You know what I am," he said quietly, his voice carrying that same cultured accent that had comforted her during their midnight race to the hospital, though now she could hear the weight of ages in his tone and understand that she was speaking to someone for whom human lifespans were merely brief chapters in an eternal story. "I've been watching over you and your daughter since the night she was born, fulfilling an ancient oath to protect those who cannot protect themselves. But I had hoped to remain hidden until she was older and less vulnerable to the dangers that my presence brings to mortal lives." Sophia stared at him as puzzle pieces clicked into place with crystalline clarity. The impossible coincidences and supernatural interventions that had marked their lives since Luna's birth, suddenly making perfect sense in the context of what he was revealing. And when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. "You're a vampire," she said. Not a question, but a statement of fact that hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning the gap between the world she had known and the one she was now entering. He nodded once, his expression grave as Luna's breathing began to even out in his arms, the fever breaking under his touch in ways that defied medical explanation, but that Sophia accepted with the pragmatism of a mother whose child was being healed by forces beyond her understanding. "I am Dorian Blackthorn, king of the North American vampire territories, bound by oaths older than your civilization to safeguard the innocent and protect those who show courage in the face of impossible odds. And you, Sophia Chen, have shown more courage than most immortals I have known across 8 centuries of existence." Terror should have consumed her. Every instinct should have screamed warnings about predators and monsters and things that hunted in the darkness. But instead, Sophia felt something like relief flooding through her chest as she finally had answers to questions that had haunted her sleep for months. "You saved us when everyone else abandoned us," she whispered, reaching out to touch Luna's now cool forehead as her daughter slept peacefully in the arms of a creature that folklore insisted should have been her greatest enemy. "Whatever you are, whatever this means, you were there when we needed you most, and that matters more than anything else I might think or feel about the impossible." Dorian's mansion rose from the forest like something out of a Gothic fairy tale, its stone walls and towering spires speaking of old-world architecture transplanted to the New World wilderness, hidden behind wards and illusions that kept it invisible to mortal eyes, while providing sanctuary for those who needed shelter from the ordinary world and its narrow definitions of reality. Sophia followed him through rooms that seemed to exist outside normal time, their furnishings spanning centuries of collected treasures, while modern conveniences were seamlessly integrated with antique grandeur, and she found herself studying portraits of pale figures in period dress whose eyes seemed to track her movement through spaces that whispered of power and ancient secrets. Luna remained calm in Dorian's arms as he explained the structure of vampire society, describing a complex hierarchy of clans and territories that had evolved over millennia to maintain order among immortal beings whose individual power could reshape the fate of nations, with himself serving as one of several regional monarchs who answered to an even older council that governed their species from hidden strongholds scattered across the globe. "The protection I have offered you comes with consequences that extend far beyond your personal safety," he said, as they settled in a library whose shelves stretched toward cathedral ceilings, lined with books in languages both living and dead. By revealing myself and acknowledging my guardianship openly, I have violated fundamental laws that have kept our kind hidden from human knowledge for thousands of years, and there are those among my people who will demand severe penalties for this transgression. As if summoned by his words, figures began materializing from shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been in the well-lit room. Vampire lords whose ages and power manifested in auras of controlled menace that made Sophia instinctively clutch Luna closer to her chest, despite the baby being safe in Dorian's protective embrace. Countess Elena Vasquez spoke first, her Spanish accent carrying the authority of 5 centuries as she addressed Dorian with formal courtesy that barely concealed her anger at his breach of protocol, while Lord Marcus Thorne paced restlessly near the windows, with movements that suggested barely leashed violence waiting for an excuse to be unleashed upon anything that threatened vampire security. The mortal has seen too much and knows too much to be allowed to return to her former life, Vasquez declared with the cold logic of someone who had survived centuries by making difficult decisions without sentiment or hesitation. Either her memories must be wiped clean of all supernatural knowledge, or she must be eliminated before she can spread word of our existence to others who might seek to exploit that information for their own purposes. Dorian's response was immediate and absolute, his voice carrying harmonics of power that made the ancient windows vibrate in their frames as he rejected both options with finality that brooked no argument from subordinates who might normally expect their counsel to carry significant weight in matters of vampire law. Sophia Chen and her daughter are under my personal protection, and any attempt to harm them or alter their memories without consent will be considered an act of war against my crown and my territory, he stated while Luna slept peacefully against his shoulder, oblivious to the supernatural politics swirling around her small form. Thorne laughed with bitter amusement at what he clearly considered a suicidal stance, pointing out that Dorian was risking not just his political position, but his immortal existence for 2 mortals whose lives would end in mere decades, regardless of whatever protection he might offer. But Sophia surprised them all by stepping forward, despite her very human fragility, among beings who could end her life with casual gestures. Her voice clear and steady, as she addressed the Vampire Council with courage, born of desperation and maternal instinct. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, looking each of them in the eye despite the predatory aura that surrounded them like visible heat. "But I won't be threatened or manipulated by anyone, immortal or otherwise. And if you think I'm going to run away and hide while good people suffer consequences for helping me and my daughter, then you understand nothing about what it means to be a mother." They offered her witness protection programs that would give her a new identity in a distant city, resources to start over somewhere far from supernatural politics and vampire territorial disputes. But Sophia shook her head with determination that reminded Dorian powerfully of another young woman who had faced impossible odds with nothing but will and love as weapons. "I'm staying," she declared, accepting Luna from Dorian's arms and holding her daughter close as she made the choice that would define the rest of their lives. "Whatever comes next, we face it together, because running away won't make us safe, and it won't make this problem disappear. It will only mean that other innocent people pay the price for my cowardice." As if responding to her mother's resolve, Luna opened her dark eyes and looked directly at each vampire in turn, and Vasquez gasped in recognition of something that made her ancient features soften with wonder rather than threat, while Thorne stepped back involuntarily as the baby's gaze seemed to see through centuries of carefully constructed defenses to the vulnerable core that still existed beneath his predatory exterior. "She has the sight," Vasquez whispered, her voice filled with awe as she knelt before Sophia and Luna, with respect that had nothing to do with politics or protocol. "This child can see our true natures, past our glamours and illusions to the essence of what we are. A gift that appears perhaps once in a millennium and marks her as a potential bridge between our worlds rather than a threat to be eliminated." In the shadows of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, Victor Dracul held court among his followers with the malevolent satisfaction of a predator who had finally cornered prey that had eluded him for too long, his pale features animated with cruel anticipation as he outlined plans that would simultaneously eliminate Dorian's mortal protégés and provide justification for challenging the current Vampire King's fitness to rule the North American territories. The Romanians' network of spies had provided detailed intelligence about Sophia Chen and her infant daughter, including medical records that revealed the child's unusual birth circumstances and subsequent development patterns that suggested supernatural sensitivity far beyond normal human parameters. Information that could be weaponized against Dorian's political position if presented properly to the Vampire Council. Marcus Reeves sat uncomfortably in a corner of the warehouse, his human fragility making him conspicuous among the gathered vampires, but his value as an inside source of information about Sophia's habits and vulnerabilities had earned him temporary protection in exchange for cooperation that would ultimately lead to his own destruction once his usefulness ended. Victor had spent decades cultivating mortal assets who could provide services that vampires couldn't easily obtain themselves, and Dr. Sarah Martinez represented his most valuable placement in the local medical establishment. Her genuine friendship with Sophia making her the perfect vehicle for gathering intelligence while maintaining plausible deniability about supernatural involvement in subsequent events. The doctor's transformation into a vampire sympathizer had been gradual and careful, beginning with small favors and escalating over months into full collaboration with Victor's plans, her medical oath twisted into justification for actions that she convinced herself served the greater good of both species, despite the obvious moral compromises involved. Meanwhile, Dorian worked tirelessly to prepare Sophia for conflicts that vampire politics made inevitable, teaching her about weaknesses that could be exploited against immortal opponents while providing protective charms whose origins stretched back to ancient traditions of cooperation between vampires and mortal allies who proved worthy of trust and respect. Their training sessions in the mansion's converted gymnasium revealed Sophia's natural athleticism and quick reflexes, but more importantly, they demonstrated her ability to remain calm under pressure and think strategically, even when facing supernatural opponents whose speed and strength far exceeded human limitations. As days turned into weeks, mutual respect deepened into something that neither of them had expected, a connection that transcended the supernatural circumstances of their meeting and touched on fundamental compatibilities of character and purpose that might have blossomed into love under less complicated circumstances. Luna seemed to thrive in the mansion's protected environment, her supernatural sensitivity allowing her to interact peacefully with vampire visitors while maintaining the innocent joy of early infancy. And watching Dorian care for her daughter with gentle competence that spoke of centuries of experience made Sophia begin to understand the depth of his commitment to their protection. But their peaceful preparations were shattered when Marcus appeared at the mansion gates, claiming desperate need to see his daughter, his demeanor suggesting genuine remorse for past failures. Though Sophia's newly trained instincts detected something false in his approach that made her hesitate despite his apparently sincere pleas for reconciliation. The truth emerged when Dr. Martinez arrived for what Sophia believed was a routine checkup for Luna, her familiar presence providing the distraction needed for Victor's forces to breach the mansion's outer defenses, while Marcus revealed his true allegiances by attempting to seize Luna during the chaos of the surprise attack. Sophia fought with desperate fury as Marcus tried to take her daughter, her training with Dorian paying dividends as she managed to prevent him from reaching the infant, despite his size advantage and willingness to use violence against the mother of his child. But the battle was decided when Dr. Martinez injected Sophia with a sedative that dropped her into unconsciousness, just as Victor himself materialized in the nursery with Luna crying in his arms. When Sophia awakened hours later, She found herself bound in the mansion's library, while Dorian knelt in defeat before Victor, who held Luna with casual disregard for her fragility as he outlined terms that would require Dorian's immediate abdication from the vampire throne in exchange for the child's continued existence. A bargain that would save one innocent life while condemning countless others to Victor's ruthless rule across the supernatural territories of an entire continent. He abandoned Cathedral of St. Erasmus, rose from the mist-shrouded valley like a monument to forgotten faith. Its Gothic spires piercing the midnight sky, while broken stained glass windows caught starlight and threw fractured rainbows across weathered stone that had witnessed centuries of both worship and bloodshed, making it the perfect neutral ground where vampire clans could gather to settle disputes according to laws older than most human civilizations. Victor Drackle stood before the crumbling altar with Luna cradled in his pale arms, the infant's unusual calm in the presence of supernatural predators serving his purposes perfectly as he addressed the assembled vampire lords who had materialized from shadows cast by moonlight streaming through the cathedral's skeletal roof, their ancient faces reflecting the gravity of a situation that could reshape the balance of power across the entire North American continent. Dorian entered through the cathedral's massive doors with apparent defeat weighing his shoulders, flanked by Sophia, whose bound hands and obvious distress painted a picture of complete capitulation to Victor's demands, though those who knew the Vampire King well might have noticed the slight tension in his movements that suggested preparation for violence rather than resignation to political destruction. The Romanian vampire began his formal challenge according to protocols established during the Dark Ages, invoking ancient rights of succession that allowed any vampire lord to claim another's territory through combat or abdication, his voice echoing through the ruined nave as he outlined Dorian's supposed failures of judgment in protecting mortals beyond the requirements of vampire law and thereby exposing their entire species to potential discovery and persecution. Dorian's response followed the expected pattern of a defeated king accepting inevitable consequences, his words carefully chosen to appear as surrender, while actually invoking obscure legal protections that had been written into vampire law during conflicts with vampire hunters centuries ago. Provisions that allowed for trial by combat when accusations involved the protection of innocents rather than simple territorial disputes. Victor's confidence in his position made him careless about examining the legal minutiae of Dorian's apparent capitulation, focusing instead on the political theater of claiming power before witnesses whose support would legitimize his rule. And so he missed the subtle implications when Dorian formally requested that his champion be allowed to represent him in the coming trial as was his right under the ancient codes. The assembled lords murmured among themselves as Victor laughed with cruel amusement at what he assumed was desperation, asking mockingly who among Dorian's followers would be foolish enough to face him in single combat when his centuries of experience and ruthless nature made victory virtually certain for any challenger stupid enough to accept such a hopeless battle. Sophia stepped forward with her chin raised in defiance that made several vampire lords lean back in surprise at her audacity. Her voice clear and steady as she claimed the right of champion under protection laws that specifically allowed mortals to represent their supernatural guardians when their own safety was at stake in disputes over guardianship obligations. Victor's expression shifted from amusement to confusion as the assembled vampires consulted ancient texts and confirmed that Sophia's claim was technically valid, though none of them had ever seen such a provision actually invoked in living memory. While Dorian maintained his facade of despair, even as he silently marveled at how perfectly his mortal protege had grasped the legal strategy he had outlined in whispered conversations during their captivity. Luna chose that moment to release a soft sound that seemed to resonate through the cathedral's stone walls, with harmonics that made every vampire present pause and turn toward the infant with expressions of wonder and unease, her dark eyes reflecting starlight as she gazed around the assembled immortals with intelligence far beyond her months of life. and Victor found his mental shields wavering under the child's innocent scrutiny in ways that suggested powers he had not anticipated encountering in one so young. Marcus Reeves emerged from the shadows behind Victor's faction, his movement fluid and predatory, in ways that finally explained his inhuman callousness during Sophia's pregnancy, and his ability to abandon her without apparent conscience, while Victor's proud introduction of his bastard half-vampire son sent shockwaves through the assembled lords who recognized the implications of hybrid bloodlines that had been thought extinct for centuries. The revelation recontextualized everything about Marcus's behavior, from his inability to form genuine emotional connections to his instinctive cruelty toward those he perceived as weak. Traits that marked him as bearing vampire heritage, diluted by human blood, but strong enough to manifest in supernatural indifference to mortal suffering, and Sophia felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place as she understood why their relationship had always felt fundamentally wrong on levels she couldn't previously articulate. Victor's strategy became clear as he outlined his vision for vampire society under his rule. A return to the old ways when immortals took what they wanted from mortals without concern for exposure or consequences, using hybrids like Marcus to blur the lines between species while maintaining vampire superiority over human cattle who existed purely for their convenience and sustenance. Dorian's apparent weakness in protecting mortals would be replaced by Victor's strength in exploiting them, a philosophy that appealed to older vampires who remembered eras when their kind ruled through fear and fed without restriction on populations that had no defense against supernatural predators who moved unseen through the darkness of ages past. But as Victor prepared to formalize his challenge through ritual combat, Luna's presence began affecting the assembled vampires in unexpected ways, her supernatural sensitivity somehow amplifying their buried humanity while weakening the mental barriers that allowed them to function as predators. And several of the ancient lords found themselves remembering mortals they had loved and lost during their own transitions from human to immortal existence centuries ago. The trial by combat commenced with ritual formality as Victor moved to the center of the cathedral's nave, his movements fluid and predatory, while Sophia positioned herself opposite him with the protective charms Dorian had given her, glowing softly against her skin, their silver light seeming to draw power from the consecrated ground beneath their feet, where countless faithful had once knelt in prayer to forces that still echoed faintly through the ancient stones. Victor's initial attacks tested Sophia's defenses with casual cruelty, his supernatural speed allowing him to circle her like a wolf toying with wounded prey, though he quickly discovered that her months of training with Dorian had instilled reflexes and strategies that made her far more dangerous than any mortal should have been when facing a vampire of his age and power. Sophia fought with the desperate precision of a mother protecting her child, every movement calculated to buy time and create openings, while Luna's continued presence somehow amplified the protective magic woven into her silver amulets, turning them into blazing shields that forced Victor to approach more cautiously than his arrogance had initially suggested would be necessary. Meanwhile, Marcus challenged Dorian to simultaneous combat in accordance with vampire law that allowed secondary disputes to be settled alongside primary challenges, his half-vampire nature making him stronger and faster than purely human opponents, while still leaving him vulnerable to the full power of an ancient king who had been honing his skills for 8 centuries of immortal existence. The symbolic nature of their battle was not lost on the assembled vampires, as Dorian's protective instincts clashed with Marcus's fundamental selfishness in a conflict that embodied the philosophical differences between the competing visions for vampire society's future. While overhead, Luna watched from her position in Dr. Martinez's reluctant arms as the doctor struggled with her own conscience over the betrayal that had led to this confrontation. The cathedral's blessed ground created unexpected complications for both vampire combatants, its consecrated nature weakening their supernatural abilities, while paradoxically strengthening the protective magic that surrounded Sophia, and allowing her to match Victor's speed for brief moments when desperation gave her strength beyond normal human limits. Victor's frustration grew as his opponent proved more resilient than anticipated, her maternal fury translating into tactical awareness that anticipated his attacks and turned his own momentum against him, while the watching vampire lords began to murmur among themselves as they recognized the possibility that this unprecedented trial might not conclude with the outcome their challenger had assumed was inevitable. Luna's cry pierced the air at the moment Victor finally managed to pin Sophia against the altar, his fangs bared for a killing strike that would end the trial and clear his path to claiming Dorian's throne. But the infant's voice carried harmonics that disrupted vampire mental controls across the entire cathedral and left Victor stunned and vulnerable to Sophia's desperate counterattack with a silver blade that had been blessed by priests centuries dead. The Romanian vampire's defeat came not through fatal injury, but through the exposure of his violations of vampire protection laws, as Luna's supernatural influence somehow compelled him to confess his systematic abuse of mortal assets and his deliberate cultivation of hybrid offspring for political purposes, crimes that carried severe penalties under the ancient codes that governed vampire society, regardless of political allegiances or territorial claims. Marcus fell to Dorian's superior skill and experience in combat that highlighted every weakness inherent in his mixed heritage, his vampire strength insufficient to compensate for lack of training and discipline, while his human emotions made him vulnerable to psychological tactics that a pure vampire would have resisted through centuries of practiced mental control. The assembled vampire council rendered judgment with the solemnity befitting such unprecedented circumstances, confirming Dorian's continued reign while decreeing Victor's exile from all vampire territories and stripping Marcus of his supernatural heritage through ancient rituals that left him fully human but alive, a mercy that reflected the unusual nature of the trial and the influence of Luna's presence on their traditionally harsh justice. Dr. Martinez stepped forward to confess her own complicity in Victor's schemes, offering her medical expertise in service to legitimate vampire-human cooperation as penance for her betrayal, while the assembled lords acknowledged that the night's events had demonstrated possibilities for integration between species that their isolationist traditions had never previously considered seriously enough to formalize into policy. The aftermath of the cathedral trial rippled through vampire society like stones thrown into still water, creating waves of change that reached ancient strongholds across multiple continents as word spread of the unprecedented trial that had seen a mortal woman serve as champion for a vampire king and emerge victorious through courage rather than supernatural power, while the infant whose presence had influenced the outcome was formally recognized as a bridge between worlds rather than a threat to be eliminated. Sophia found herself occupying a unique position in the supernatural hierarchy, neither vampire nor fully human, but something new that commanded respect from both communities. Her role as Luna's mother and Dorian's trusted ally, giving her authority that transcended traditional species boundaries, while her proven courage in facing vampire lords earned her status as an honored protector worthy of consultation on matters affecting both populations. Luna's future became the subject of intense speculation among vampire scholars who recognized her potential to serve as a future leader capable of uniting human and immortal societies in ways that previous generations had never imagined possible. Her supernatural sensitivity, allowing her to communicate with vampires, while her human heritage kept her connected to mortal concerns that pure immortals often forgot in their centuries of detached existence. Marcus faced exile from the only communities he had ever known, his stripped vampire heritage leaving him vulnerable to the normal human aging process, while his memories of supernatural power made his reduced circumstances feel like a prison sentence that would last for whatever remained of his now limited lifespan, though some observe that his forced humanity might eventually teach him the empathy that his hybrid nature had never allowed him to develop naturally. Dr. Martinez channeled her medical expertise into research projects that explored the possibilities of vampire human cooperation in healthcare. Her intimate knowledge of both species' physiologies, making her invaluable in developing treatments that could benefit mortal patients while advancing vampire understanding of their own immortal biology. And her dedication to redemptive service gradually earned forgiveness from those she had betrayed through her earlier collaboration with Victor's destructive ambitions. Dorian's kingship was not only confirmed, but strengthened by the trial's outcome, his willingness to risk everything for mortal protégés, demonstrating leadership qualities that impressed even his harshest critics among the vampire nobility, while his successful navigation of the legal challenges showed political sophistication that would serve him well in the difficult negotiations that lay ahead, as vampire society adapted to unprecedented changes in their relationship with the human world. The cathedral itself became a symbol of the new era, its consecrated ground where mortal courage had triumphed over immortal arrogance, serving as a meeting place where representatives of both species could gather to discuss matters of mutual concern, while the spiritual significance of the location reminded all participants of higher purposes that transcended immediate political considerations. But even as they celebrated victory over immediate threats, disturbing reports began reaching Dorian's network of contacts across the Atlantic, whispers of ancient European vampire houses that were taking increased interest in Luna's unique nature and her potential impact on the carefully maintained balance of power that had kept supernatural politics stable for centuries, suggesting that their recent troubles might prove to be merely the opening moves in a much larger game whose stakes extended far beyond the borders of any single territory or the ambitions of any individual vampire lord. Sophia found herself studying maps of the Old World with growing concern as Dorian explained the complex web of alliances and enmities that connected vampire houses whose origins stretched back to the earliest nights of their species, while Luna continued her rapid development under the watchful eyes of immortal guardians who understood that her safety might ultimately depend on their ability to navigate political waters far more treacherous than anything they had yet encountered in their battles for acceptance and survival. The future stretched before them full of promise and peril in equal measure, as the family they had forged through adversity prepared to face challenges that would test not only their individual strengths, but their collective commitment to building a world where love could triumph over fear and understanding, could bridge the ancient gulf between mortal and immortal hearts, seeking connection across the vast darkness of eternity itself. 6 months after the cathedral trial, that had forever changed the dynamics between vampire and human worlds, Sophia Chen had settled into a rhythm of life within Dorian's estate that felt both surreal and surprisingly natural, her days filled with the ordinary chaos of caring for a rapidly developing infant, while surrounded by the extraordinary reality of immortal beings who moved through shadowed halls with centuries of accumulated wisdom and carefully controlled power. The protected wing of the mansion had been transformed into a haven that blended modern convenience with supernatural security. Nursery monitors enhanced with protective wards, while baby-proofed furniture incorporated defensive measures that could repel threats both mundane and mystical, creating an environment where Luna could explore her expanding world with the fearless curiosity of childhood while remaining safe from dangers that most parents never had to consider. Dorian approached the challenges of human parenting with the methodical patience of someone who had mastered countless skills across 8 centuries of existence. Though he often found himself consulting books on child development with the same intensity he once applied to military strategy and political negotiation, his immortal nature making him remarkably suited to the sleep-deprived demands of caring for an infant whose supernatural sensitivity meant that traditional parenting advice rarely applied to their unique circumstances. Sophia watched with growing affection as the vampire king who commanded respect and fear from immortal lords across continents learned to change diapers with supernatural speed and efficiency, his ancient hands gentle beyond measure as he rocked Luna to sleep, while humming melodies from eras when the songs had been new and the composers still drew breath in lungs that had long since turned to dust. Their domestic life took on patterns that accommodated both human needs and vampire customs, with Sophia adapting her schedule to match the nocturnal rhythms of the household, while Dorian made efforts to appreciate daylight hours, even though sunlight caused him discomfort that centuries of conditioning had taught him to endure rather than enjoy. Their mutual accommodation creating a framework for coexistence that served as a model for the broader integration they hoped to achieve between their respective communities. Professional fulfillment came through Sophia's growing role in modernizing vampire infrastructure, her design skills proving invaluable in creating safe houses that appeared normal to human observation, while incorporating hidden chambers and escape routes that could protect immortal occupants from both supernatural threats and potential government scrutiny, while her understanding of digital communication helped vampire networks maintain contact across vast distances without leaving electronic traces that might expose their existence to hostile investigators. Luna's development proceeded at an accelerated pace that amazed even vampire observers accustomed to supernatural phenomena. Her ability to calm aggressive immortals becoming so pronounced that visiting lords would seek her presence when tensions ran high during political negotiations, while her apparent communication with the estate's wildlife created a menagerie of animal guardians who seemed to understand their role in protecting the special child, who could speak to them in ways that transcended normal boundaries between species. The deepening relationship between Dorian and Sophia grew through shared responsibility and mutual respect that gradually blossomed into love neither had expected to find, given the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting, their connection strengthening as they navigated the challenges of raising Luna together while building trust that bridged the fundamental differences between mortal and immortal perspectives on life and commitment and the meaning of forever, when one partner would age and die while the other remained unchanged for eternity. But their peaceful sanctuary faced new challenges when Agent Rebecca Torres of the Federal Bureau of Investigation began investigating reports of unusual activity in their region, her methodical approach to unexplained phenomena leading her to focus on Sophia's miraculous survival during the storm that had brought her to Dorian's attention, while her determination to uncover the truth threatened to expose secrets that could endanger not just their small family, but the entire network of supernatural beings who had found refuge in the shadows of human ignorance. Agent Rebecca Torres possessed the relentless curiosity and analytical mind that had made her one of the Bureau's most effective investigators of unexplained phenomena. Her 15-year career built on solving cases that other agents dismissed as hoaxes or coincidences, and her current focus on the Chen case stemmed from statistical anomalies that her trained eye recognized as patterns suggesting deliberate intervention rather than random chance in a series of events that had saved a pregnant woman's life under impossible circumstances. The official reports painted a picture of extraordinary luck, but Torres had learned to look beneath surface explanations for the hidden structures that connected seemingly unrelated incidents, and Sophia's story contained too many convenient coincidences to be explained by fortune alone, from the mysterious stranger who had appeared during the storm to the subsequent protection from her ex-boyfriend's harassment that had allowed her to build a stable life for her infant daughter. Vampire Society scrambled to maintain their carefully constructed cover stories while protecting Sophia's ability to live a normal life, with Dorian's network working overtime to create plausible explanations for every supernatural intervention that had marked her journey from abandoned pregnant woman to thriving single mother, though their efforts were complicated by Torres's expertise in detecting the kind of systematic deception that lesser investigators might have overlooked entirely. Sophia found herself torn between loyalty to the vampire family that had saved and sheltered her and her instinctive honesty when dealing with legitimate government authority. her conscience troubled by the necessity of lying to a federal agent whose dedication to truth reminded her of her own values, even as she recognized that complete honesty could destroy the lives of everyone she had come to love over the past months of unprecedented happiness. Dorian's revelation of his past cooperation with government agencies during World War II added complexity to their situation. His centuries of experience, including clandestine work with Allied intelligence services that had earned him both valuable contacts and dangerous enemies within federal bureaucracies that had long memories for supernatural assets who had once proved useful in conflicts where conventional forces needed advantages that only immortal abilities could provide. The delicate balance they had maintained collapsed when Torres made an unannounced visit to Sophia's apartment and witnessed Luna demonstrating abilities that no normal infant should possess. The baby's response to the federal agent's presence, including behaviors that could not be explained by any combination of precocity and coincidence. While Torres's trained observation skills allowed her to catalog supernatural phenomena that previous investigators might have dismissed as imagination or parental exaggeration. The ultimatum came with professional courtesy that barely concealed underlying steel. As Torres outlined her evidence of systematic supernatural activity in the region and demanded full disclosure of the truth behind Sophia's remarkable story, warning that continued deception would force her to recommend federal intervention that could expose not just their small group, but potentially an entire hidden community whose existence the government might view as either asset or threat, depending on how the revelation was handled. Sophia realized that their choice was no longer between exposure and secrecy, but between controlled revelation and chaotic discovery, the federal investigation having progressed too far to be derailed by misdirection or intimidation, while Luna's obvious supernatural abilities made denial impossible for anyone with Torres's level of training and dedication to uncovering hidden truths, regardless of their inconvenience to established worldviews. Dorian acknowledged the shifting dynamics with characteristic strategic thinking, recognizing that Torres represented either their greatest threat or their most valuable ally, depending on how skillfully they could navigate the treacherous waters of first contact between official government authority and supernatural community leadership, while the stakes of their decision extended far beyond their personal safety to encompass the future of vampire-human relations across an entire continent. The Vampire Council convened an emergency session within hours of Torres's ultimatum, ancient lords gathering in the mansion's hidden chambers to debate responses that ranged from immediate elimination of the federal threat to complex schemes for managing the exposure that now seemed inevitable given the investigators' persistence and growing evidence of supernatural activity that could no longer be dismissed or explained through conventional means. Countess Vasquez advocated for swift action to silence Torres permanently before she could file reports that might trigger larger governmental investigations, her centuries of experience having taught her that mortal authorities posed existential threats to vampire security whenever they gained concrete evidence of immortal existence, while Lord Thorne supported more subtle approaches involving memory modification and misdirection that would leave the agent alive but unable to pursue her current line of investigation. Sophia surprised the assembled vampires by proposing a radically different strategy, suggesting that controlled revelation to carefully selected government officials might create opportunities for official cooperation rather than inevitable conflict. Her argument based on the recognition that modern surveillance technology and investigative techniques made permanent secrecy increasingly difficult to maintain, regardless of how carefully they attempted to cover their tracks. The proposal sparked heated debate among immortals whose survival had depended for centuries on remaining hidden from human knowledge. Many arguing that any official recognition would lead inevitably to registration programs and government control that would transform free vampire lords into monitored assets, subject to political pressures and bureaucratic oversight that could prove more restrictive than any persecution they had previously endured. Dorian's support for Sophia's plan carried decisive weight in the council's deliberations. His political standing strengthened by the recent trial victory, allowing him to advocate for risks that might have been rejected if proposed by someone with less proven judgment. While his historical experience with government cooperation provided context that helped skeptical lords understand potential benefits of official alliance rather than perpetual antagonism toward mortal authorities. Torres's own investigation had uncovered historical evidence of vampire-human cooperation during major crises. Her research into World War II intelligence files, revealing references to supernatural assets whose contributions had been classified at levels that suggested government awareness of immortal communities dating back decades, if not centuries. Information that supported Sophia's argument that revelation might formalize relationships that already existed in unofficial forms. The negotiation meeting took place in neutral territory, with security provided by both sides. Torres arriving with backup agents positioned at strategic distances, while Dorian brought vampire guards whose presence remained hidden, but whose protection ensured that any betrayal would be met with immediate and overwhelming response. The tension between supernatural and governmental authority, creating an atmosphere where every word carried implications that could determine whether their species would find peaceful coexistence or inevitable conflict. Luna's role proved crucial in humanizing the vampire community for Torres, the federal agent's maternal instincts responding to the infant's obvious contentment and healthy development in supernatural custody, while the baby's supernatural abilities demonstrated in controlled fashion provided concrete evidence that cooperation between species could produce beneficial outcomes rather than dangerous complications that government intervention might need to contain or eliminate. The agreement they eventually reached established parameters for limited disclosure to select officials with appropriate security clearances, creating frameworks for cooperation that would provide government protection of vampire territories in exchange for supernatural assistance with threats that conventional law enforcement could not address effectively, while maintaining secrecy from general populations who were not yet ready to accept evidence of immortal neighbors living hidden among them. Torres accepted the role of liaison between federal authority and vampire leadership, her investigation evolving into protection detail that would shield their community from hostile government factions while facilitating cooperation with agencies that could benefit from supernatural expertise in matters ranging from counterterrorism to scientific research, where vampire knowledge might prove invaluable to national security interests. The precedent they established would serve as foundation for similar agreements across other regions where vampire communities existed in proximity to government installations, creating networks of cooperation that formalized relationships while maintaining plausible deniability for politicians who preferred not to acknowledge officially what their intelligence services had known unofficially for generations of classified operations that relied on assets whose abilities exceeded normal human limitations in ways that could not be explained to voters or oversight committees without exposing secrets that had shaped history, from shadows where immortal powers had influenced mortal events in ways that official records could never fully document or acknowledge. And the arrival of Countess Elisabetta Drakel at Dorian's estate came without warning or invitation, her ancient convoy of black vehicles materializing from mist that seemed to follow her across the Atlantic from strongholds that had stood since before Columbus ever dreamed of western shores. And when she emerged from her limousine with the fluid grace of 8 centuries spent perfecting the art of intimidation, even the experienced vampire guards who protected the mansion grounds stepped back involuntarily from the aura of old-world power that surrounded her like visible darkness. Elisabetta represented everything that New World vampires had left behind when they crossed the ocean in search of freedom from the rigid hierarchies and blood-soaked traditions that had governed immortal society since the fall of Rome. Her very presence a reminder that some members of their species viewed adaptation and integration as weakness rather than evolution, While her claim to authority over Luna's future rested on genealogical research that connected the infant's mixed heritage to bloodlines that predated the establishment of territorial boundaries between European and American vampire domains. The Countess entered the mansion with the confidence of someone accustomed to deference from lesser immortals, her pale beauty unmarked by time, yet somehow conveying the weight of centuries spent accumulating power through methods that would have horrified Sophia if she had understood the full implications of what old-world vampire nobility considered acceptable means of maintaining control over both mortal and immortal populations. Her proposal came couched in diplomatic language that barely concealed its underlying threat, offering alliance between the ancient European houses and Dorian's progressive American territories through an arranged marriage that would bind Luna to vampire nobility when she came of age, ensuring that her unique abilities would serve traditional vampire interests rather than the dangerous experiment in human integration that Dorian's reign represented to conservative factions who viewed any cooperation with mortals as betrayal of their species' natural superiority. Sophia's response was immediate and absolute, her maternal fury blazing with protective fire that made even ancient vampires pause in recognition of the primal force that could drive mortal mothers to challenge immortal predators when their children's welfare was threatened. Her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands as she informed Elisabetta that Luna would never be bartered away like political currency, regardless of whatever traditions or genealogical claims the European houses might invoke to justify their ambitions. Dorian found himself caught between competing loyalties that threatened to tear apart the careful balance he had maintained between his roles as vampire king, responsible for political stability across an entire continent, and surrogate father to an infant whose protection had become more important to him than his own immortal existence. While the diplomatic necessities of avoiding open war with European powers clashed with his personal commitment to the family that had given his centuries of lonely rule meaning beyond mere duty to subjects who respected his authority, but had never truly known his heart. The cultural divide between old and New World vampire philosophies became apparent in every exchange between Elisabetta's entourage and Dorian's household, with European vampires displaying barely concealed disdain for the integrated lifestyle that allowed mortals like Sophia to move freely among immortals as equals, rather than servants or prey. While American vampires responded with protective instincts that prioritized Luna's welfare over political considerations that meant nothing compared to the bonds of chosen family that had formed during months of shared danger and mutual support. Luna herself seemed to sense the tension surrounding adult debates about her future, her supernatural sensitivity manifesting in ways that clearly indicated preferences, despite her inability to articulate them through normal infant communication. Her obvious contentment in Dorian and Sophia's arms contrasting sharply with her distressed reactions whenever Elisabetta attempted to approach or hold her. As if the baby could perceive fundamental differences in intention and character that adult negotiations might obscure through diplomatic niceties. The negotiations stretched across days of careful maneuvering as both sides tested boundaries and explored possibilities for compromise that might satisfy European concerns about Luna's development while preserving the autonomy that Sophia demanded for her daughter's future choices. Though underlying tensions made clear that peaceful resolution would require more than diplomatic skill, if ancient prejudices and modern innovations could not find common ground in their shared interest in Luna's remarkable potential to bridge worlds that had remained separate for millennia. Luna's growing supernatural abilities began manifesting in ways that transcended normal vampire talents, her infant mind somehow accessing genetic memories that spanned both her human maternal lineage and the immortal bloodlines that connected through Dorian's ancient heritage, creating windows into the past that revealed secrets both sides had forgotten or deliberately hidden from subsequent generations who might have used such knowledge to challenge established power structures. Through Luna's innocent touch, forgotten histories emerged like dreams made visible, showing Sophia glimpses of her own ancestry that included vampire hunters who had eventually become protectors and allies rather than enemies. Their transformation from persecution to cooperation, providing precedent for the integration that modern circumstances were forcing vampire society to consider as necessity rather than choice, in a world where technology and government surveillance made permanent secrecy increasingly impossible to maintain. The revelations that flowed through Luna's supernatural sensitivity uncovered an ancient prophecy that had been dismissed by most vampires as medieval superstition, but now seemed frighteningly relevant to their current circumstances. Speaking of a bridge builder who would either unite the mortal and immortal worlds in lasting peace, or destroy both species through conflicts that would expose supernatural existence to human populations, unprepared to accept the reality of predators who had shared their world since civilization began. Elisabetta's true purpose became clear as she attempted to use Luna's abilities to access old world vampire secrets that had been lost during various purges and political upheavals across European history, ancient knowledge of supernatural powers and hidden bloodlines that could reshape the balance of power among immortal houses if recovered and properly understood by those with sufficient ruthlessness to exploit such information for political advantage over rivals who had grown complacent in their modern comfort. Dorian's own heritage proved more significant than even he had realized when Luna's genetic memory revealed his bloodline's connection to the original vampire covenant makers who had established the fundamental laws governing immortal society, explaining both his instinctive understanding of vampire leadership and his protective nature toward mortals that had always set him apart from purely predatory members of his species, who viewed human life as expendable resource rather than sacred trust. Sophia discovered through Luna's revelations that her family's history included generations of women who had served as bridges between supernatural and mortal communities, their genetic legacy explaining her rapid adaptation to vampire society and her intuitive understanding of the diplomatic balance required to maintain peace between species whose fundamental natures seemed designed for eternal conflict rather than cooperation. The prophecy's implications sent shockwaves through both vampire and government circles as word spread of Luna's potential to fundamentally alter the relationship between mortal and immortal worlds, making her simultaneously the most valuable and most dangerous individual on Earth, depending on how her unique abilities developed and which factions gained influence over her upbringing and education in the complex realities of supernatural politics. Multiple groups now maneuvered for position in the struggle to control or eliminate Luna, before her powers could mature enough to fulfill either the destructive or redemptive aspects of the ancient prophecy, with some factions viewing her as the key to vampire domination of human society, while others saw her as an existential threat to immortal secrecy that had protected their species from persecution for thousands of years of hidden coexistence with populations who remained ignorant of the predators living among them. The stakes of every decision regarding Luna's future expanded beyond personal or even regional concerns to encompass the fate of entire civilizations whose survival might depend on whether the bridge builder became a force for unity and understanding or a catalyst for the kind of supernatural war that could expose both species to destruction through conflicts that mortal governments and immortal powers were equally unprepared to survive without catastrophic losses that would reshape the world in ways that no prophecy could fully predict or prevent. The Grand Assembly of Vampire Houses convened in the restored Cathedral of St. Erasmus, the same consecrated ground where Dorian's authority had been challenged and confirmed, now serving as neutral territory where representatives from across the globe could gather to address questions that would determine their species' future in a rapidly changing world where traditional isolation was becoming impossible to maintain against advancing human technology and government scrutiny. Ancient lords who had not spoken face-to-face for centuries materialized from shadows cast by candlelight that flickered across stone walls, bearing witness to supernatural debates that would have terrified mortal observers even as they shaped policies affecting millions of humans who remained unaware of the immortal powers determining their fate through decisions made in darkness by beings whose perspectives transcended normal human understanding of time and consequence. Dorian's opening speech challenged fundamental assumptions that had governed vampire society since its earliest nights, arguing that evolution and cooperation offered better long-term survival prospects than the domination and secrecy that had protected their kind in simpler eras, but now risked exposure and persecution if they failed to adapt to realities that made their traditional isolation increasingly unsustainable against mortal authorities equipped with surveillance technologies that could detect supernatural activity despite centuries of experience in remaining hidden. Conservative factions led by Elisabetta responded with passionate defenses of proven methods that had ensured vampire survival through dark ages and inquisitions and world wars. Their arguments emphasizing the dangers of revealing immortal existence to mortal populations whose historical responses to supernatural threats had typically involved attempts at extermination rather than negotiation, while progressive voices countered that modern circumstances required unprecedented solutions to challenges that traditional approaches could not address effectively. Sophia's testimony provided human perspective that many assembled vampires had never encountered firsthand. Her description of the fear and wonder and eventual acceptance that had marked her journey from terrified, abandoned mother to trusted partner in supernatural politics, demonstrating that mortals could indeed adapt to knowledge of immortal neighbors if such revelations were managed carefully, rather than imposed through traumatic exposure or hostile confrontation, that would inevitably trigger defensive responses based on ancient prejudices and survival instincts. Luna's demonstration of her unique abilities silenced skeptics who had dismissed prophecy as superstition, the infant's supernatural influence calming ancient animosities and allowing previously hostile factions to experience unprecedented empathy that transcended species boundaries, while her innocent presence somehow enabled vampire lords to remember their own lost humanity and mortals to overcome instinctive fear of predatory immortals, whose nature they could sense, but no longer perceived as inherently threatening. Elisabetta's formal challenge to Dorian's leadership represented the Old Guard's final attempt to maintain traditional vampire supremacy over human cattle. Her call for single combat to determine Luna's future and the direction of immortal society, forcing the Assembly to choose between evolution and stagnation, between cooperation and domination, between the ancient ways that had preserved their species through millennia of persecution and new paths that offered unprecedented opportunities for growth and integration with the mortal world that surrounded them. Agent Torres's arrival with official government backing provided Sophia with unexpected leverage in negotiations that had seemed weighted toward vampire interests, her presence demonstrating that human authorities were already aware of supernatural existence and prepared to work with immortal communities that proved willing to cooperate rather than continuing to hide from detection that advancing technology would make impossible, regardless of how carefully vampires attempted to maintain traditional secrecy. The vote that followed reflected deep divisions within vampire society between traditionalists who feared change would lead to destruction and progressives who believed adaptation was necessary for survival, with Luna's continued influence somehow enabling both factions to find common ground in their shared desire to protect her unique potential, while ensuring she remained free to choose her own path, rather than being constrained by ancient prophecies or political necessities that adults projected onto an infant whose destiny remained unwritten. The compromise they eventually reached established unprecedented frameworks for Luna's upbringing in both human and vampire worlds, ensuring she would understand both heritages while remaining free to determine her own role in the future relationship between mortal and immortal civilizations. her education encompassing diplomatic skills and supernatural abilities, while her protection was guaranteed by formal treaties between vampire houses and government agencies that recognized mutual benefits of cooperation over the alternative conflicts that could destroy both species. If fear and prejudice prevailed over wisdom and hope in the challenges that lay ahead for all who shared the world, regardless of whether they drew breath or sustained themselves on blood, or possessed lifespans measured in decades or centuries, or the endless nights that stretched toward horizons no mortal eye would ever see. 2 years had passed since the Grand Assembly that forever changed the relationship between vampire and human worlds, and the small upstate town that had once been notable only for its quiet streets and struggling local businesses had become an unlikely model for supernatural integration, with Dorian's estate serving as headquarters for initiatives that brought together mortal and immortal communities in ways that would have been unimaginable before Luna Chen entered the world during that fateful storm that had seemed like an ending, but proved to be the beginning of something unprecedented in the long history of both species. Sophia's design firm had evolved far beyond traditional architecture to specialize in creating spaces that accommodated the unique needs of supernatural beings while appearing completely normal to uninitiated human observers. Her innovative solutions ranging from government safe houses with hidden chambers designed for vampire refugees to community centers where mortal families could interact safely with immortal neighbors who were slowly revealing themselves to carefully selected humans deemed ready to accept the reality of predators who had learned to be protectors instead. Luna's development as a toddler continued to amaze everyone who witnessed her remarkable abilities. Her empathy, allowing her to sense and soothe distress in both humans and vampires, while her supernatural control manifested in ways that suggested she would grow into powers that could reshape the fundamental dynamics between species, though her parents were careful to ensure she retained the innocent joy of childhood despite the extraordinary responsibilities that might someday rest on her small shoulders. The local community had grown to include nearly a dozen human families who worked directly with the vampire population, their integration facilitated by Taurus's careful screening process that identified individuals whose psychological profiles suggested they could adapt to supernatural reality without the traumatic breakdown that less stable personalities might experience when confronted with evidence that monsters from fairy tales lived next door and shopped at the same grocery stores where they bought milk for their own children. Agent Torres had transformed her role from federal investigator to government liaison, specializing in supernatural affairs. Her success with the Vampire Integration Project leading to assignments across the country, where other immortal communities were beginning to emerge from centuries of hiding as technological advances and changing social conditions made traditional secrecy increasingly difficult to maintain, without the kind of support that official recognition could provide through carefully managed disclosure programs. Professional fulfillment came naturally to Sophia as her work expanded to include consultation on international projects where vampire houses in other countries sought to replicate the American model of human integration. Her expertise in bridging cultural gaps between species, making her invaluable to diplomatic efforts that required someone who understood both mortal practicality and immortal politics well enough to navigate the complex negotiations that determined whether integration succeeded or failed catastrophically. Family life had settled into rhythms that felt both extraordinary and completely natural as Dorian learned to balance his centuries of accumulated wisdom with the immediate demands of raising a toddler whose bedtime stories often included lessons about vampire history alongside traditional fairy tales. While Sophia found herself serving as interpreter between Luna's supernatural sensitivity and the normal childhood experiences that would help her daughter develop emotional intelligence to complement her remarkable abilities. Marcus's return after 2 years of imposed exile came as a surprise to everyone except Luna, who seemed to sense his approach days before he actually appeared at the estate gates, seeking permission to speak with Sophia about the possibility of establishing some relationship with the daughter whose existence he had once fled from in cowardice, that now seemed incomprehensible to his transformed perspective on responsibility and family obligations. His journey back to full humanity had been difficult and humbling, the loss of his supernatural abilities forcing him to confront weaknesses and character flaws that his vampire heritage had previously allowed him to ignore or rationalize away. While therapy and genuine soul-searching had gradually taught him empathy that his hybrid nature had never permitted him to develop naturally during his years of emotional manipulation and selfish behavior. Sophia's willingness to consider supervised visits reflected her own growth from the terrified, abandoned woman who had given birth beside a flooded highway to a confident leader who understood that forgiveness could coexist with appropriate caution when someone demonstrated genuine change through consistent actions rather than empty promises. Though her protective instincts remained vigilant against any sign that Marcus might revert to the callous selfishness that had characterized his previous attempts at involvement in Luna's life. The memorial garden beside Highway 47 had become Sophia's place of monthly pilgrimage, a carefully landscaped space where storm victims were remembered through plantings that bloomed in cycles throughout the year, ensuring that beauty and life would mark the spot where terror and abandonment had once threatened to claim two innocent lives before supernatural intervention changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Standing among the midnight orchids that somehow grew wild in this consecrated ground, despite their exotic nature, Sophia reflected on the journey that had transformed her from victim to survivor to leader in a community that spanned the boundaries between mortal and immortal existence. Her monthly visits serving as reminders of how far she had traveled from the desperate woman who had once knelt on wet asphalt believing she would die alone and forgotten. Luna accompanied these visits with the solemn understanding that only supernatural children seem to possess, her small hand finding Sophia's fingers as she gazed toward the bridge where her mother's rescue had begun, and though she lacked the vocabulary to articulate what she sensed about this place, her behavior suggested awareness that her story had roots in the darkness and storm that had preceded her birth into a world where love could triumph over abandonment if courage found strength to accept help from unexpected sources. Dorian's transformation from solitary vampire king to devoted family man represented perhaps the most remarkable change of all. His centuries of lonely rule having taught him duty and responsibility, but never the simple joy that came from watching Luna take her first steps or hearing her attempt to pronounce his name in the babbling language that preceded true speech, while his growing love for Sophia proved that even immortal hearts could learn new rhythms when they found partners worthy of the vulnerability that genuine affection required from beings accustomed to emotional isolation. The success of their integration model had attracted attention from other supernatural communities across the globe, with werewolf packs and fae courts and various magical practitioners sending delegations to study methods that had achieved peaceful coexistence without the catastrophic exposure that most immortal beings feared would result from any contact with mortal authorities. Though some groups remained skeptical that such cooperation could be sustained when immediate crises passed and old prejudices reasserted themselves through generational changes in leadership. Marcus's redemption proceeded slowly but steadily through actions rather than words. His determination to prove worthy of even limited contact with Luna, manifesting in volunteer work with abandoned children, and consistent therapy that addressed the character flaws that had made him capable of leaving a pregnant woman beside a flooded road when courage and decency demanded he stay and help regardless of his own fear and inadequacy. New challenges emerged as werewolf territorial disputes in the Pacific Northwest threatened to expose supernatural existence through violent conflicts that human authorities could not ignore indefinitely, requiring vampire-human cooperation agreements to expand into broader alliances that could address threats from species whose integration into mortal society presented different complications than those that vampires had learned to navigate through careful diplomacy and gradual revelation. Yet hope for the future remained bright, as Luna's unique nature continued to offer possibilities for even broader supernatural peace. Her ability to communicate across species boundaries suggesting that the next generation might achieve integration that their parents could only begin through tentative first steps toward understanding and cooperation between communities whose ancient animosities were slowly giving way to recognition of shared interests in survival and prosperity in a changing world. Dorian and Sophia found their own relationship deepening as shared responsibilities and mutual respect evolved into love that neither had expected to discover, given the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting. Their partnership, providing stability and emotional fulfillment that enhanced their individual strengths while creating synergies that made them more effective leaders than either could have been alone in the complex task of building bridges between worlds that had remained separate for millennia of mutual ignorance and suspicion. Luna's third birthday celebration brought together an unprecedented gathering of humans and vampires on the grounds of Dorian's estate. The festive atmosphere marking not just the passage of another year in a remarkable child's life, but also the establishment of traditions that would define a new era of supernatural human relations built on foundations of trust and cooperation, rather than fear and secrecy that had characterized previous interactions between mortal and immortal communities. Sophia watched her daughter navigate the party with the natural diplomacy of someone born to bridge worlds, equally comfortable accepting gifts from ancient vampire lords and playing games with human children whose parents had become integral parts of their extended supernatural family. Luna's innocent interactions demonstrating possibilities that previous generations had never imagined could exist between species whose fundamental natures seemed designed for eternal conflict rather than peaceful coexistence. Dorian moved through the celebration with quiet satisfaction as he observed the fulfillment of dreams that had sustained him through centuries of lonely rule. His transformation from isolated protector to beloved partner and father, representing personal growth that had seemed impossible during the long decades when duty had been his only companion and hope had withered under the weight of accumulated losses. That immortal existence inevitably brought to those who dared to care about mortal beings whose lifespans flickered past like candle flames in cosmic darkness. The assembled guests included representatives from vampire houses across the continent, alongside human families and government liaisons whose presence testified to the success of integration efforts that had begun with one woman's desperate need for help during a midnight storm and evolved into formal alliances that were reshaping supernatural politics on a global scale. As other communities studied their model for achieving peaceful revelation, without the catastrophic exposure that most immortal beings had feared would destroy both species, through conflicts, neither was prepared to survive. Torres mingled easily among immortal and mortal attendees alike. Her transformation from federal investigator to trusted intermediary, reflecting broader changes in government attitudes toward supernatural communities, whose existence was gradually being acknowledged through classified programs that provided official protection in exchange for cooperation on matters of national security, where immortal abilities offered advantages that conventional resources could not match against emerging threats that required supernatural solutions. Agent Rebecca Martinez had returned to the medical community with new purpose as she worked to establish healthcare protocols that could serve both human and vampire populations. Her expertise in supernatural physiology making her invaluable to integration efforts that required medical professionals who understood the unique challenges of treating immortal patients while maintaining secrecy from civilian populations not yet ready to accept evidence of predatory neighbors whose dietary requirements remained fundamentally incompatible with normal human moral frameworks. Marcus stood at the periphery of the celebration with the humble demeanor of someone who understood his place in the complex family dynamics that had evolved during his absence. his limited visitation rights hard-won through consistent demonstration of the character growth that had transformed him from selfish coward to reliable presence who could be trusted with supervised interaction with the daughter whose birth had once terrified him into abandonment, that now seemed incomprehensible given his current understanding of parental responsibility and love. As evening approached and guests began departing with promises to maintain the connections that had been strengthened through shared celebration, Dorian found a moment alone with Sophia beside the garden, where Luna played with supernatural contentment among flowers that seemed to glow with inner light in the gathering dusk. And with movements that carried 8 centuries of accumulated grace, he knelt before the woman who had transformed his immortal existence from duty into joy, while presenting a ring that had belonged to his lost mortal wife Elena, but now symbolized not replacement, but renewal of hope, that love could indeed transcend the barriers between species and lifespans, and the fundamental differences that had kept their kinds apart for millennia of mutual misunderstanding. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon as they exchanged vows that formalized commitments already proven through months of shared danger and gradual trust. But the approaching weather brought gentle rain rather than the violent tempest that had marked their first meeting, as if nature itself was blessing their union and the new chapter in supernatural human relations that their love represented for communities across the globe who were watching their experiment in integration with hope and trepidation in equal measure. Luna pointed toward the first stars appearing through breaks in the clouds as her parents began planning their forever together, her small voice attempting to name constellations that held meaning for both mortal and immortal observers who had learned to share the sky despite their different relationships with daylight and darkness, and the eternal cycles that governed life and death, and the spaces between where love could flourish against all odds, when courage and compassion overcame ancient fears that had kept worlds apart for far too long, before a mother's desperation and a vampire king's redemptive honor proved that some bridges were strong enough to bear the weight of entire civilizations crossing toward understanding that neither had dared hope they might achieve until one stormy night changed everything forever.